Hi guys, my name's Yi Chow, and you guys are watching Extra Life. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and for supporting us. Right now, I'm here with Ian Duke, Magic R&D member, and we're going to be able to ask him some of the questions that you guys shared as part of donating and helping to support Extra Life. So thank you guys for your support and your questions, and thank you so much for joining us, Ian.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So we're going to start off with a pretty easy question, or maybe it's the hardest question. If you were a Magic card throughout Magic's history, what card best represents you?
That's a tough one. Which one best represents me? I can tell you my favorite card.
Okay.
So my favorite card is Pox. This is a card from Ice Age that makes both players sacrifice, a bunch of everything. You lose life, you sacrifice permanents, you discard cards from your hand, and it's a little bit of a math puzzle too, because you're discarding, or you're sacrificing 1/3 of what you have.
Oh.
So it's really fun looking for kind of those break points where like, okay, my opponent just hit their 4th land drop, so now they have to sacrifice 2. And I like that card a lot because I like resource denial strategies and kind of being like the last man standing in a game. If I could be a card, though, that's a sort of a different question there.
Okay.
I was kind of in the tank when I was looking over the questions earlier on this one. I think it'd be some kind of wizard, probably. I always wanted to be a wizard when I was a kid, and it's actually kind of ironic because I am actually a wizard now, but not the type of wizard necessarily that I thought I'd be. But maybe like Arcanus the Omnipotent or something like that. It was a pretty cool wizard, and being omnipotent sounds pretty sweet.
Yeah, that seems like a good perk.
If not for that, then if I can kind of go outside the box a little bit more, I think being a Shivan Dragon would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
I think just being a badass and nobody can really challenge you sounds like a good thing to be.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. So one of our donors wanted to ask, they said, I once had a victory in a draft that was so weird, funny, and unbelievable that I got my opponent to sign the card with the game circumstances so that I could have proof. Have you ever had anything like that? And if so, let's hear the deets.
I can't say I've ever had an opponent sign a card for me. I do own a lot of signed cards in my collection. Way back in the day when I first started playing Magic, it was probably, I think, a little bit after Ice Age came out. Yeah, I think like Alliances was the first set that came out after I started playing. And back in those days, I always loved to trade for like one-of-a-kind type cards, either like signed cards or like really rare, cards from Beta or like Arabian Nights. And back in those days, this was kind of like the mid-1990s, I guess. There wasn't really like the internet wasn't really prolific there. It was kind of hard to trade like across the country, so it was kind of like whatever cards were in your area were like the cards you had access to. So there'd be cards floating around that were like signed by the artist or signed by like a player or something like that, or Richard Garfield. That would be like floating around the area, and everyone would try to like trade for them or collect them or whatever. And so I remember like certain specific exact copies of cards, and some of them ended up in my collection. One of the most memorable for me was there was a copy of Candelabra of Tawnos from the Antiquities, really rare artifact. Yeah. And it was like creased in half. And whenever I'd see it in some of these binders, I'd be like, oh sweet, like a Candelabra of Tawnos, and pull it out and it was creased in half. I'd be like, sad face. But I remember that exact copy of that card like floating around and circulating in our play area for like months and months, and each time I'd see someone's binder, it would be like a different person's binder, just kind of kicking around or whatever. So anyway, a lot of those exact copies of cards kind of like hold nostalgia for me, and I like that a lot. So signing cards is super cool. But I can't say I've ever had my opponent sign a card for me after beating them in a game or playing a game against them.
Yeah,
that's a cool story though. I like that.
Definitely. And I like your story too. It's kind of like this bygone era where nowadays with trading all over the world, right?
That's right, yeah.
It's kind of very different. Another fan wanted to know, they said Cube is their favorite format. They say, I play it nonstop when I can. Why isn't Cube a staple format that exists all year?
That's a great question. I assume this person is talking about Magic Online because, of course, if you own your own cube or your play group has a cube, you can play Cube all the time. So that's, first of all, I think that one of the best ways to play Magic and to play Cube specifically. Why isn't Cube available all year round? I can't necessarily speak to that. My guess is it's kind of like, if every day were, your favorite holiday or whatever, Christmas morning or whatever it is that you personally enjoy. Then it kind of starts to lose that specialness a little bit, So I think part of why people love Cube is because it is special and you only get to do it once in a while. That said, Cube is super fun and repeatable. You can play it a lot, but I think that's part of it, is kind of like preserving that, this feels really special, this is awesome kind of a thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's a great decision to kind of just build your own paper cube, and that way you can play it anytime you want. What card in Kaladesh changed the most after being handed over from design?
Wow, that's a really tough question. I guess it kind of gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about the design and development process. So it's hard to point to one specific card because actually most sets end up changing quite a bit from design to development. I would say by the time like the dust is settled at the end of the development process, probably about half the set was designed during the development process and half was during design. And a part of that is that development really is just a continuation of the design process. I like to think of it as just like one kind of continuous thing from start to finish, and then design is kind of the first half of that process. It's more focused on like what is the vision of the set, how do we want to make you feel when you're playing the set, what are the mechanics, kind of like the very top level,
right.
Zoomed out look at what the set is. And of course a lot of the individual cards do get designed during that process. But when things hand off from design to development, the set is still very much in flux. We're still trying things out. Sometimes even whole mechanics change.
Wow.
And definitely a lot of the individual cards change as well. So it can be hard to trace like one card's history all the way from design through to development. And in fact, a lot of the cards just get completely redesigned as we go anyway. That said, actually Kaladesh is one of the sets that, in my memory, actually changed the least from design to development on the individual card basis. There are quite a few cards that are like almost exactly intact from early on in the design process. One that I can think of off the top of my head is Lathnu Hellion, I think it's called.
Oh yeah.
And Demon of Dark Schemes, I think are two of the cards in there that may have been previewed already. And those cards were from very early in the design file and more or less remained unchanged as we went through. Not for a lack of getting attention, but just because like they were just the
really
right cards.
solid,
They were really solid designs. That said, there's plenty of stuff that we did design during the development process, like all of the gear hulks, for example, got added.
Oh, wow.
We play tested a lot and changed a lot about vehicles. We were kind of still nailing down how we wanted that mechanic to work as we went along, and so those cards went through dozens of iterations and dozens of redesigns. So there's lots of stuff that remained all the way through and was awesome, and then there's lots of stuff that we kind of took a second look at and redesigned as we went along. So
yeah, very cool. So another question we had from a fan is, can you talk about how cards are balanced to be enjoyed but not overpowered, and how you guys do power balancing in
that's
general?
a great question.
Yeah.
So let's see. I guess the easiest way to answer this is to say how we aim cards to see play and to be cards that you might want to put in like your standard constructed deck, for example. We always try to aim cards right at the line, and by the line I mean the line where like you might consider putting it in your deck. It might be strong enough to play. We don't try to aim cards as like surefire hits, because there's always going to be a little bit of like uncertainty or kind of variance in where we aim a card versus where it actually shows up in the real world. I like to think of it like doing a scientific experiment, how you have error bars on all of your data points, right? And so all of our cards, our data points, have error bars on them. They're either going to be a little bit stronger, a little bit weaker than we thought they were going to be. And so by aiming right at the line, we ensure that if we missed a little bit and the card is stronger than we thought it was, then it's not going to be too far over the line. And if we missed below, then okay, nobody ends up playing that card, but it's not like the biggest deal in the world. There are, if the card is really important and we really want to make sure, that it hits, we'll look for other ways to do that rather than just making it more powerful. So we'll try to make sure that like the deck exists that this card really wants to go in, or say if it's like a multicolor card, we'll give enough support to make sure that like two-color deck exists in standard, that kind of a thing. But we really try to avoid like hammering a single card into place and making it really, really super powerful to make sure that it'll hit, because when you do things like that, if it does turn out to be even stronger than you thought it was, then you're going to be in a really bad situation there.
Sure.
So it's really like a probabilistic kind of thing. We aim a lot of cards to be like maybes, and then we know that some of them will hit and some of them won't, just based on kind of the fluctuations there. And I think that's really the best way to end up doing things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another fan wanted to ask, what is your favorite Magic mechanic and why?
Ooh, that's a really good one. I guess my simple answer would probably be flying.
Oh, yeah.
I just think having kind of two different axes in which combat can happen is a really interesting thing. Flying's a lot more interesting than unblockable, because you can interact with it. You just need to kind of have your own flying or reach creature. And I think it just plays really well. Flying helps end games at the like limited Magic, which is as kind of like a proxy for beginner Magic as well. Sometimes when you see beginners playing, They're really scared to attack. I don't know what's going to happen if I send my creature into combat, so I'm just going to kind of wait a little while and see how things pan out. And that can cause games to stagnate a little bit. So having just like a simple flying creature like a Windrake or something is just a really easy way. Like, hey, my opponent can't block this. I'll just send my creature in, get 2 damage in, and that'll lead toward the game ending. So that's probably my answer there. As far as mechanics that I've liked recently that we've done, I think Prowess is really fun as well.
Yeah.
I really like the deck that encourages where you need to find the right mix of creatures and spells in your deck. I think if there's anything else that I really like there. I thought Delirium was really cool and Shadows Block as well. Again, it's a really interesting deck building challenge, trying to get lots of different card types into your deck, and it might encourage you to play cards that you might not otherwise play just for the sake of, say, having an enchantment or 2 in your deck that you might not otherwise have had. So yeah, I guess that's, without thinking about it too much, those are kind of my quick answers to that.
Yeah, totally. I really enjoyed playing with Delirium in that there was a lot of discovery when drafting, right? Like, I'm like, a 2/1 artifact creature, why would ever, I know why I want to play this, because when it dies, and that's kind of the layers of that is really exciting. But I love the answer of flying, too, because I think for a lot of Magic players that's been playing for a while, some of the evergreen mechanics they don't even think about. And flying is just so elegant in that it's so easy to understand, but it so affects the game, and it really helps new players learn how to play. Which is really cool.
Totally. I love when the name of a mechanic really matches up to like how it actually works in the game, and I think like flying is just such a great example. If you think back to some of the early iconic creatures like Mahamoti Jin and Shivan Dragon, Sarah Angel, there's something about that. Like, I get it. this flies. It's hard to block. It's soaring over the battlefield. And it feels awesome.
Yeah,
it's pretty. It is awesome.
Yeah, definitely. If you could play one Magic format for the rest of time, all of time, what would you choose?
Wow. So I'm like stranded on a desert island.
Desert island, and for some reason there's a rules judge saying you can't play other formats.
Oh, that's tough. So if I get to kind of bend the rules a little bit, I would say just limited in general, especially if I get to vary up which set I'm playing. I've always been a limited player myself, throughout my Magic history. That's the format I love the most. I do enjoy playing with different sets though, so if you say I have to only play one limited format, probably like the original Innistrad is one of my favorite ones, for sure. I think Rise of the Eldrazi was also really fun, a little bit more complex, but if I've got all the time in the world, that's totally cool. Let's see, I think, there's certainly been standard formats that I've really enjoyed. I think when Innistrad and Return to Ravnica were the blocks in Standard. That was one of my favorite Standard formats. I really enjoyed a lot. Would love to explore that.
What were some of the decks from that
So there were a lot of 3-color decks too. There was like black, green, white Reanimator deck with like Thrag Tusks and Restoration Angels and stuff. That was really fun. There was a human based aggro deck, 3 colors, also really fun. Sphinx's Revelation was in the format too. That's one of the cards that, like, personally as a player, I really liked. It did some kind of weird things to the format that, as a game designer, maybe I don't like as much. But certainly playing it was really fun.
Definitely.
And then like Cube Draft, also another favorite format of mine. That would be a good choice too if I had to nail myself down to just one particular card set to play with and be a really well designed cube.
Cool. I agree. That sounds awesome. All right. Another player wanted to ask. What cards have seen lots of constructed play that you weren't expecting? So something that kind of popped out of that error ratio.
Yeah, that's a really good question too. A little bit difficult to answer because, again, as I said earlier, it's a probabilistic type approach, right? Sure. So usually when a card sees play in constructed, we are aware that it could have seen play, or something that we sort of intended to see play to a certain degree. So I wouldn't say there are any like super huge surprises in the last couple years. I guess a couple kind of like supporting cards that occasionally show up, like Vessel of Nascency is a card that's shown up a little bit in Standard. That wasn't something that we, if I had to write down a list of like most probable cards to see Standard play, that probably wouldn't have been on my list going into the format. And part of that is sometimes when cards surprise us, it's because of the history of changes in our own testing process.
Oh, sure.
So, like for example, in the case of Vessel of Nascency, this is a card that people are using to enable Delirium and to cast Emrakul. In our testing process for quite a while, the card Crop Sigil, I think it ended up being called, was stronger than it is currently in the real world. So we were playing with a stronger version of that card, and at that time, Crop Sigil was the best way to enable Delirium.
Gotcha.
It was an enchantment. It milled you every turn. I forget exactly what the numbers were on the card, but it was just a little bit stronger in a couple different ways. And so those are the ways that some surprises can happen if like we were playing for quite some time with things being different, then we make a few changes before we're ready to set out into the real world, and then because of those changes that we made, other cards rise up because of that. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good example.
Yeah, I think that also really speaks to part of what makes Magic so fascinating and so challenging and so the longevity of its engagement is that there's so many knobs and dials, right?
Absolutely.
Like, just by dialing this one card down a little, all of a sudden this card gets a chance to really shine.
Totally
right?
true. I was actually chatting with some of the players. I just got back from PAX, actually. This is a couple days after PAX. And over the weekend, I was chatting with some of the World Championship players, and we were talking about what is it like to work on Magic sets when they're still in design and development, and how is it like to prepare for the standard environment.
Right.
And one of the things I said was like, okay, so you guys, you'll go to play test for the Pro Tour, right? And some people like to rent a house with a bunch of their friends. They'll have 12 or 15 people all play testing at the Pro Tour for a couple of weeks, and then they go off and they play their decks. And I was like, imagine that testing process where there's about a dozen of you, and you rent out a house, and you're playing lots, and you're exploring the format for a couple weeks. Imagine at the end of that process, if we said, okay, all the best decks that you guys have found and all the strongest cards, we're going to nerf those cards and change them. We're going to change all those decks because those are the strongest decks.
Sure.
And then we're going to rerun that process again. Okay, so now you can test for another 2 or 3 weeks, right? Then we'll make more changes, and you do that like 4 or 5 times, right? And so over the course of that, you're coming up with the best decks, you're finding the strongest cards, and then things are changing, and now you're having to do that all over again,
right.
Just kind of repeating through that. And so by the end of that, yes, you will have played with some cards along the way that didn't end up being, strong cards in the real world, or there were some cards that weren't really strong, but then things changed enough that they did rise to the top. So there can be a lot of flux throughout the process, and I think in the end it's really fun, but it's a pretty crazy thing, playing with cards and decks that never end up actually existing in the state that you played with them for a while. So.
Yeah, I'm sure that's kind of mind-melting too, to then 2 years later trying to remember that against what's happening in the real world and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
too.
it definitely can be. It can be a challenge for me doing commentary in the Pro Tour also, because sometimes it's a card that I played with for 3 months, and it did this for a while, and then we tweaked one little thing or whatever, so then recalling those changes and matching up against the real world, that's probably the most challenging aspect, I think.
That's fair. That's funny. Another player I wanted to ask, how do you guys decide which dual land cycle is right for which set, and what do you think makes a good dual land?
That's a fantastic question. Dual lands are something that we think about a lot during the development process, and it's something that we put a lot of thought into planning ahead of time, actually. So the simplest answer is we need to make sure you can cast your spells in standard, right?
Yeah.
So we want the dual lands to be strong enough that mana bases have the right degree of consistency to them, and a big part of that is how many colors do we want you playing in standard at this time? So take Khans of Tarkir, for example.
Right.
When that set came out, we really wanted 3-color decks to be a thing.
Totally.
So we gave a little bit of extra mana fixing. We included the tri-lands, as they're called, the taps for 3 colors of mana, and fetch lands as well are strong dual lands.
Yeah.
In order to make sure that it was possible to play those 3-color decks, that they would succeed and have the right amount of consistency. In other formats, we might want you to play fewer colors and focus more on 2-color decks. Two-color decks are a really good baseline, I think, for Magic,
Sure.
where most of the time that's where we want the most consistent mana bases. That's not to say we only want you to play 2-color decks,
Right.
because Magic is about exploration, right? We want to give you plenty of options, but we do want it to cost you in terms of deck building if you want to go above 2 colors
Sure.
most of the time. And by cost you, I mean in the consistency of your deck. So those are things we're thinking about there too. We also think about tapped versus untapped is a really big deal.
Yeah.
So designs that can enter the battlefield untapped mean that decks with strong early games are going to be a little bit stronger there. So if you're an aggressive creature deck that wants to curve out, maybe play a 1-drop on turn 1, we want to make sure that you have untapped lands if we want those decks to succeed. So take the enemy fast lands in Kaladesh, are a pretty good example of that. We knew that with Origins rotating out and the Pain lands and Origins leaving standard,
right.
we wanted to make sure that those were replaced by enemy color lands that entered the battlefield untapped early in the game, so that aggressive enemy color decks could succeed with those. So yeah, that's another area where we're thinking about. And then frankly, we want things to rotate a little bit.
Sure.
Big part of why standard Magic is super fun is because as each new set rotates in and sets rotate out, things change a little bit.
Yeah.
And dual lands are one of the ways that we can shake up standard, in that we can speed things up, slow things down. We can make allied color versus enemy colored rise and fall a little bit. We can make 3-color decks versus 2-color decks rise and fall a little bit. So it's really something that we're kind of looking at the long-term cyclical nature of Magic when we're deciding on dual lands.
Very cool. Awesome. Another question we had is, the finals of Eldritch Moon Pro Tour saw Emrakul and Liliana facing off. Is this how the Future League, which is the team that tests future standard decks, is that how that team saw the format coming together?
That's a cool question. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
It was super exciting, by the way, watching the Pro Tour unfold and almost seeing the story moments of Magic come to life, right?
Yeah,
It's like Liliana
awesome.
and her horde of zombies against Emrakul. Tamio shows up and taps down Emrakul for a turn to, give the Gatewatch some time.
Right.
That kind of thing. And honestly, I think that's an area where we've made huge progress in Magic recently, is lining up what is powerful with what we want you to care about in the storyline.
Sure.
And not only does that make the story kind of ring a little bit louder for players, that if you're seeing those types of moments unfold in your games, then it kind of resonates with what's happening in the storyline. But I think it also helps a lot for new players when we're saying these are the important characters, these are the important story moments, this is what we want you to focus on. And then when those cards actually are awesome in the game, it just makes sense, right? It's
Right.
this is the thing you're telling me is awesome, it actually is awesome, everything lines up. Whereas earlier on in Magic, I can't speak to exactly what the process was internally because I've only been here since Theros was sort of the first set that I worked on.
Oh.
But if you go even way farther back than that, a decade ago or even more, as a player, to me it almost felt kind of random or haphazard which cards were the strongest cards.
Right.
Like Astral Slide, for example, right? This is just kind of a random card,
enchantment,
right?
yeah.
It's a random enchantment, it's doing this thing. The thing it's doing is not particularly that fun or easy to understand why it's exciting for a new player,
Right.
and that kind of thing. So I think back then it was more about the mechanics of the cards, and you had to be a really strong player to kind of key into what actually was awesome, and the things that looked awesome to new players weren't actually that awesome. Shivan Dragon and stuff like that was not a tournament Magic card, but it was one of the cards that people really gravitated to early on. And I think in general, just lining up what you expect to be awesome with what is awesome, both from a storyline perspective as well as what's easy to understand that is awesome, is just a really huge win for Magic in the long term.
Definitely, yeah. It's been really exciting to see, and it's just kind of mind blowing to see the Pro Tour reenact that story.
Yeah, I love
That was
it.
awesome. So another question a fan had was, when you guys set the rarity of a card, what are some differences that set commons apart from uncommons?
Good question. So thinking about common versus uncommon, probably the two major factors there are card complexity and thinking about limited power balance. So kind of going through those one at a time. As far as complexity is concerned, we want to make sure that our commons are easier to understand and a little bit more accessible, especially for newer players or people who are just returning to the game after a long break. So things we're thinking about there are how wordy are our commons, trying to keep the number of words per card down a little bit, and then just how complicated are the effects of the commons, something we also try to minimize. So for example, a card with a really complicated triggered ability, or something that references other cards you may not have seen yet, for example, referencing a Planeswalker tends to push things up in rarity because as a new player you may not have seen a Planeswalker card yet. So that's one thing we're thinking about. The second is balancing for limited play. We tend to allow our uncommons to be a little bit more powerful than commons, which sounds silly to say, but the reason that's really important is for diversity of limited play over time. Since the uncommons appear less frequently, they have the opportunity to make each draft, for example, feel different from the last.
Cool.
So when we give you those little bumps of power spike at uncommon, that's something that you're not going to see necessarily in every draft or every play session. And so when they do come along, they're a little bit more exciting there. So that's not to say that across the board, higher rarity means more powerful, but specifically looking at common and uncommon for limited play, we allow the uncommons to range a little bit higher than the commons to give you that power spike, that excitement of every once in a while.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. Another fan wanted to know, what is it like doing live commentary on Magic, and how do you prepare for each event?
First of all, it's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of hard work also.
Yeah.
Sometimes those tournament days are 12 hours long or something like that. Yeah, it's a great time for sure. It can be very difficult in a number of different ways. First of all, just being in the booth and watching a Magic game. Magic is a complex game, both in terms of like the game state and what's actually happening per the rules and the mechanics, but also just thinking about what the players are thinking. It's a game of incomplete information, so when you're looking at the board state and you're trying to think about what a player might do or why they're doing the things that they're doing, you also have to factor in that they don't know what their opponent knows. So you kind of have to be able to put yourself in the frame of mind of either player at any given time and imagine what it would be like if you didn't have the complete information of everything that's going on in the game state, and think about what they're thinking about. It can also be a little bit difficult to tell what's going on sometimes with respect to like player communication and exactly how the players are navigating a particular sequence and things like that. So it's just a lot of being very careful, listening, and using all the tools that you have to gather information and how to put that all together. And then you want to be thinking about how is the viewer experiencing this, and taking all that information that you're collecting and kind of presenting it as a package to the viewer that then they can understand, and also aiming that commentary and description of the game at a number of different levels of play. We want, if a player's family is tuning in and maybe they don't know that much about Magic, we want them at least to be able to follow kind of the narrative of what's going on with the game, but then we also want our commentary to ring true for people that know a tremendous amount about the game and maybe have played that exact matchup 100 times before, and just want to know the nitty-gritty details of exactly what's happening, and who's winning the game and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things to think about for sure.
That's a tough thing to balance between all of these different parts, right? Like, and trying to both speak to our very enfranchised fans who really want these sort of strategies and kind of the thought processes behind sequencing, and then still telling the narrative of what's happening in the
Definitely.
game to the people who are just tuning in for the first time.
And then the second part of that question was about preparation. So preparing, playing a lot of Magic for sure. Part of my preparation is that I've worked on the sets and played a lot internally, but sometimes that could be 9 months or a year before the tournament is actually happening. So there's definitely a lot of like brushing back up. Sometimes I'll go and play on Magic Online or go play, live at an F&M or something like that to just get some more practice with the decks. There's also a lot of reading articles and paying attention to what's going on in the community and on the internet, trying to keep up to date on both strategy as well as like what players are talking about and what decks are popular. And then the hardest thing for me always is, sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit here, just recovering from being at PAX and doing a lot of commentary also.
Speaking of.
The hardest thing for me is always the card names, because I will have played with the cards for sometimes 6 months or a year, and they have different names as things go along. It'll start off with just a simple playtest name, and then it'll go through a couple iterations of our creative team actually coming in and naming the card. And so remembering, usually I'm very, very good at remembering what the cards do, but actually which card is named what name. Sometimes I'll be thinking back to like a previous version of the name or something like that, and I'll have to catch myself. So always probably the thing that I spend maybe the most time on is just reading through and memorizing the new card names and making sure I'm up to date on that. It's kind of silly, but it's definitely one of the more challenging things.
Totally makes sense. And wrapping up here with the last question, we don't want to take all of your voice here, but speaking of playtest names and card names, was there any playtest name that really stood out, that was memorable, lovable, or silly to you?
Ooh, I like this question. Yes is the answer. There are some that stand out. It's tough for me to remember exactly off the top of my head. One that I can think about from Kaladesh that I really liked is there's a card, I think it ended up being called Bomat Courier.
Okay.
And for the longest time, its playtest name was like the Mail Bug, basically. It's this little artifact creature that runs around like delivering mail to people or something like that. So we always just called it the Mail Bug and still do a lot internally.
It's pretty cute.
Yeah, I like that one a lot.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and for chatting with us. And thank you guys for watching. And thank you guys for supporting Extra Life. And we'll see you guys hopefully at coverage and at events and throughout Magic. See you guys later.